Well, welcome back to another episode of Finance Uncut, where we talk everything finance and economics from an Austrian perspective. Now, on today's episode, we're going to do a two-part video series where I give two examples of policies that I believe our government should be implementing today. I've been very critical lately about our government deficit and debt position. Where our government just announced a $1.1 trillion debt, which is expected to grow to $1.8 trillion by 2030 and not to be paid back by 2080. And a lot of people have said, well, Steve, what would you do? What would you do differently? And so in this two-part video series, I'm going to give two examples of policies that have happened in the past, and we're going to have a look at their results and compare it to today. So can Scott Morrison, our current Prime Minister, save Australia? Well, according to John Adams, only our 10th Prime Minister can save Australia. Now, John Adams is an Australian economist, one of the very few Austrian economists. He was an economic advisor to the Assistant Treasurer of Australia, Arthur Senedinas, and I recommend that you sign up to his free newsletter. So let's have a look at this article. As I said, we're going to do this in a two-part video where I'll give you two examples of policies that I would implement if I was Prime Minister today. So let's have a look at this. Australia is now at a point of economic devastation with little prospect of recovery unless dramatic policy action is taken. Well, I think perhaps we're now at the point of no return. But anyway, let's keep reading. As outlined recently in my article, Australia has been economically destroyed within 4 weeks. The Morrison government, coupled with all state and territory governments, have in March-April 2020 unleashed the largest set of monetary and fiscal stimulus packages in Australian history, resulting from their decision, and that's key, their decision to lock down the Australian economy in the wake of the Cerveza Cygnus public health crisis. As noted in this recent article, the combined stimulus packages, which stands in excess of $417 billion, have resulted in significant damage to the purchasing power of the Australian dollar and the fiscal balance sheet of all governments in Australia, especially the federal government. Only a program of economic austerity and structural economic reform that includes 1. Running a prudent monetary policy, which means ending QE and raising interest rates. 2. Producing continual and large budget surpluses through significant reductions in federal as well as state and territory government spending as well as restructuring the Australian banking system that encourages lending to productive businesses rather than fueling asset speculation. Now, I agree with all of those things, and you might be sitting there right now just disagreeing with all those things, because modern theory says to do exactly the opposite of what John is saying right here. However, history tells us that this is exactly what we should be doing. And Austrian theory in particular, on that second point, talks about and explains how when government go into the economy, when they borrow and spend, they're taking away funds from the private sector, and it actually doesn't increase the economy. In fact, even the great Keynesian economist Dr. Lacey Hunt says that basically Keynesian economics has now failed. That's his own theory. He's a Keynesian. That once upon a time, when a government would borrow a dollar, they would get, say, $1.20 in GDP output. That's been diminishing over years, where it's now to the point where he says for every dollar borrowed, we get about 25 cents. So it now has diminishing returns, and in fact, to try to grow the economy through government spending, the government actually has to really turn on the printing presses, which has other significant consequences. So it just doesn't work anymore. It worked for a little while there, but it doesn't anymore. Among other reforms, can ensure that Australian experiences robust economic growth, a stable and trusted currency, a more diverse, productive and internationally competitive economy with reduced and sustainable public and private sector debt levels. In the absence of such a program, Australia risks facing an economic catastrophe of ever-increasing debt and monetary inflationism, resulting in either a sovereign debt crisis resulting in debt restructuring or an outright default of government debt, hyperinflation and or increased tax confiscation and wealth confiscation, with superannuation being the prime candidate, as it always is. Now, we're going to look at inflation in more detail shortly. The political dilemma of implementing economic austerity. Implementing economic austerity within a democratic political system is no easy task. Given Australia's record levels of household debt and foreign debt, economic austerity requires individual Australian households and businesses to experience significant financial pain, which, given the extent, both size and breadth of the debt bubble, will include insolvencies and bankruptcies for businesses, loss of wealth with sharp falls in asset prices such as real estate, bonds, fixed income securities and shares, lost income for investors as company dividends are cut or suspended, as commercial and or residential property rents are reduced and vacancy rates increase. Well, we've seen that, haven't we? So dividends were cut or suspended. APRA put restrictions on the banks' dividends that they could pay out, and we're certainly seeing some of those rents coming down and vacancy rates increasing in certain areas. In fact, according to our last census, we have 1.2 million vacant properties in Australia. Unemployment for households and significant social costs, which may in some cases include relationship breakdown, temporary homelessness, rising crime rates, increased substance abuse and or emotional and mental distress. These costs are unavoidable and are indeed necessary, given that in a debt-laden speculative asset bubble economy, real resources such as capital, land, labour and entrepreneurs are tied up in industries associated with speculative asset bubbles and debt-fueled consumption, such as finance, real estate, property construction, retail and entertainment, which need to be redeployed to other profitable businesses and industries that can produce goods and services at prices that are wanted by both the Australian and international markets. Given these economic and social costs, some, such as Alexander Tytler, have argued that implementing a long-term program of economic austerity is virtually impossible in a democratic system, given the expected resistance to such a program from free-riding voters. Now, I will give a bit of a modern example to some economic austerity countries that implemented economic austerity that have actually had tremendous growth in the last, let's say, 7 years or so, where the rest of Europe have just gone nowhere. Japan's gone nowhere. So I'll give an example later on. So according to Tytler, a democracy is always temporary in nature. It simply cannot exist as a permanent form of government. A democracy will continue to exist up until the time that voters discover that they can vote themselves generous gifts from the public treasury. From that moment on, the majority always votes for the candidates who promise the most benefits from the public treasury, with the result that every democracy will finally collapse due to loose fiscal policy, which is always followed by dictatorship. And that is so true, and that is why I am an advocate for sound money, gold and silver, absolutely 100%, because it puts restrictions on governments on what they can spend. Who can economically save Australia? The question which results from this political dilemma is who within Australia is able to politically convince a majority of Australians to absorb a significant amount of personal financial pain and social costs while the economy restructures. In recent events within the federal as well as state and territory parliaments and legislative assemblies are any guide, it would appear there are no contemporary politicians who are capable of such a feat, given that they all either explicitly or implicitly endorsed the national approach to dealing with the cerveza sickness, including the lockdown of the Australian economy, and the stimulus packages that their respective parliament and legislative assemblies implemented. So basically no one today is going to do this. This is what they've decided to do the lockdowns and to do the massive stimulus packages. So they're not going to do what the country actually needs. Rather, if Australian history is reviewed, it would appear that only Joseph Lyons, Australia's 10th Prime Minister, and the man who led Australia through the Great Depression, has the capacity, the conviction, and the track record to lead Australia out of the current economic abyss. Now, Lyons, who served as Prime Minister from 1932 until his death in office on Good Friday in 1939, remains one of the most remarkable figures in Australian political history, given that, upon becoming Tasmanian Premier in October 1923, Lyons took decisive action to restore the financial health of the Tasmanian government by producing a string of budget surpluses after inheriting a government which was experiencing crippling budget deficits and chronic public sector debt incurred by the predecessor government of Sir Walter Henry Lee. Lyons, as acting treasurer in the Scullin federal government in 1930, advocated for a policy prescription of economic austerity that included balanced government budget, sound money, debt reduction, and microeconomic reform that reduced business costs. Lyons' advocacy manifested itself into an economic austerity proposal known as the Premier's Plan, which he put forward and was agreed to at the August 1930 Melbourne Premiers' Conference. Lyons, as a lifelong member of the Australian Labor Party, Lyons served as the Tasmanian ALP Premier and Cabinet Minister in the ALP Scullin government from 1929, resigned from Cabinet in January 1931 and then from the ALP in March of 1931, going to the crossbench, given his opposition to Treasurer Ted Theodore's economic prescriptions of monetary and fiscal stimulus, including money printing. I think he means currency printing. Quantitative easing, low interest rates, and budget deficits through additional government spending. So basically the policy prescriptions our modern politicians are implementing right now. Lyons went on to join the opposition within the Federal House of Representatives as their leader under a new political party called the United Australia Party in May of 1931. The UAP was the predecessor to the modern-day Liberal Party and therefore officially became the leader of the opposition. Lyons went on to contest the December 1931 federal election as the alternative Prime Minister. Lyons' victory at the December 1931 election was the largest election victory in Australian history and was won on a platform of economic austerity. So he went to the election with a platform of economic austerity, and the people of Australia who had some gumption, who had some courage, who had some conviction, who had some character, that knew what the medicine needed to be, took that medicine and voted in a Prime Minister who was going to bring in economic austerity. As Prime Minister, Lyons achieved one of the highest rates of economic growth in the developed world as measured by real gross domestic product of 16.6% between 1929 to 1940 compared to the United States of only 1.6%. And we'll have a look at this in more detail. Despite unemployment hitting 32% in 1932, the second highest rate of unemployment in the world at the time, unemployment in Australia fell to single digits by 1936, less than 4 years later, under Lyons' economic leadership, whereas unemployment rate in the US only fell to 15.5% in 1936. So Lyons' leadership ensured that Australia maintained political and social cohesion, whereas many other countries descended into political extremism and social unrest. It is for these reasons, among others, that I rank Lyons as Australia's greatest of all-time political figures in an article published by news.com.au in June 2017, ahead of more notable political figures such as Menzies, Hawke and Howard. So 1931 economic austerity versus 2020 monetary inflationism and budget deficit financing. What the Lyons Prime Ministerial record demonstrates is that the economic policies selected and implemented in 1931 versus those now being implemented in 2020 could not be starker. During the 1920s, the Australian federal government, especially the government of Stanley and Bruce, and various state governments had racked up breathtaking debts, borrowing vast sums from London's financial institutions to finance significant infrastructure and public works projects following the collapse of commodity prices in 1921. These debts were in addition to the debts incurred during World War I. According to Gerald Stone, the Australian Federation owed more to the financial houses of London than all of the governments of Europe, Africa, the Far East, Middle East, and South America combined. It ranked as the most credit-addicted, debt-ridden country on earth, next only to Germany. At the commencement of the Great Depression, with the New York stock market collapse in October 1929, Australia faced a sovereign debt crisis, with the prices of wool and wheat collapsing, thus triggering a sharp loss of economic income, especially export income. This crisis transformed itself into a balance of payments crisis as financial institutions in London, i.e. Australia's creditors, rapidly lost confidence in Australia's ability to meet their debt obligations. In response, according to the Honourable Chris Bowen MP, Treasurer Ted Theodore sought to expand the money supply through quantitative easing via the Fiduciary Notes Bill of 1931. This proposed legislation sought to create 18 million new Australian pounds, of which 1 million pounds would be used for employment creation schemes and 6 million would be made available for farm finance. Moreover, at the February 1931 Premiers' Conference, Treasurer Theodore argued for a reduction in interest rates, a halt to falling wages, the devaluation of the Australian pound, and active intervention by the Commonwealth Bank, Australia's central bank at the time, to increase the money supply. Basically, all the policies that governments and central banks around the world are implementing today. These proposals were met with fierce opposition, especially as they were polar opposite to the agreed economic plan of the August 1930 Premiers' Conference. The opposition to Theodore's plan were widespread and included elements of the Scullin government, including Lyons, who, as noted above, resigned from the ALP in March of 31, the federal opposition within the House of Representatives, the Commonwealth Bank itself, Australia's creditors in London, the mainstream media, and the majority of the Australian people. Everyone took opposition to Theodore's plans, and, well, we saw that in the election, Lyons was able to win the biggest landslide in Australia's history. The Theodore economic prescription was roundly defeated at the December 1931 election by Joseph Lyons in the largest election victory in Australia's history, securing 76% of the seats within the House of Reps, so I just mentioned that. On that occasion, Australians chose not to head down the path of monetary inflationism, rampant budget deficits, and soaring public debts. While the immediate economic pain was severe for a large minority of the Australian people, the economy was able to be reset upon a solid foundation which facilitated a fast recovery. In 2020, however, as noted in Australia has been economically destroyed within 4 weeks, the governments of Australia have adopted the polar opposite policy prescription encompassing monetary inflationism via ultra-low interest rates, quantitative easing and repo liquidity operations, financial bailout packages through expansionary fiscal deficits that include support for employers, employees, and those already on social security payments, and the accumulation of ever greater amounts of private and public sector debt. Neither contemporary nor historical empirical economic evidence suggests that the Australian economy will enjoy a robust and sustainable recovery into the 2020s with rising real living standards once the economic lockdown is lifted. Conclusion. In the history of Australian parliamentary democracy, no individual member or senator has shown the principal economic leadership which was displayed by Joseph Lyons in the 1930s. No political figure in Australian history has quit both cabinet and their political party on the account of a high principle of public policy, convinced the nation of the virtues of their public policy position, became the alternative leader and won a landslide election victory, and then gone to successfully lead the nation through a crisis back to recovery. This phenomenal feat, on top of his achievement of financially rescuing the Tasmanian government as Premier, is simply extraordinary. To many Australians, Joseph Lyons has been lost in the sands of time and his achievements have largely been forgotten. However, no political leader other than Lyons can boast of such a record while simultaneously uniting the majority of Australians and avoiding major political and social unrest and turmoil. If Australia is ever going to recover from the disastrous economic policies of the Morrison state and territory governments in the wake of the Cerveza sickness crisis, principled economic leadership that is focused on a strong and stable currency, balanced government budgets and low levels of public sector debt, non-speculative lending by banks and financial institutions, and microeconomic reform that reduces the cost of production and enhances multi-factor productivity and international competitiveness will be required. Never since his death in 1939 have Australians needed Joseph Lyons like we do now. So what should the government do? The government should follow the same policies of former Australian Prime Minister Joseph Lyons. And when we have a look at what he implemented sound money, which is gold and silver. He advocated for cuts in public spending, balanced budgets, and he increased interest rates. So he basically did everything opposite to what we're doing today. All we're doing today is kicking the can down the road, creating an even worse problem for future generations to sort after, to work out. And they're just going to keep kicking the can down the road until ultimately the whole thing blows up, and the pain when it ultimately blows up is going to be 100 times worse than if we just took the medicine today and did what was right. So if we have a look at, in the US, compare the US to Australia. In the US, they did exactly what we're doing today. Cut interest rates to next to nothing, to almost zero. Massive government spending, stimulus, budget deficits, the central bank quantitative easing. They did all of the prescriptions that Western governments are doing today. And when we have a look, we can see that GDP growth in Australia was 16.9%. Oops, sorry about that. 16.6% compared to the US at 1.6%. Australia's unemployment in 1932 actually peaked at 32% compared to the US at 24%. So Australia peaked at higher unemployment. However, less than 4 years later, it was about 3.5 years later, Australia's unemployment had fell from 32 to 9%, whereas in the US they could only get it down from 24 to 15.5%. So the policy differences between the US and Australia is just a clear example. We've got an example right here, and we can see what worked and what didn't work. You can see it's not the greatest graph here, quality graph, but you can see that the UK had implemented very similar policies to Australia, and from a GDP point of view, they fell, but then they had tremendous growth, and even 1938. So in the US, they went back into recession in 1937, where the UK and Australia actually grew their GDP, and they never went back into recession. So 1920-21 depression, this is where we're going to end the first part of this video, and we'll look at the 1920-21 depression, which was an even bigger deflationary depression than the 1930s, but it's classified as the depression that nobody remembers. So we're going to look at that in our next video. So what do you guys think so far? I'm sure I've probably angered many of you or challenged some of your thinking, because it's been really a modern day phenomenon. Jim Rickards says that sound money, as in gold and silver, as the economic basis of the monetary system. The last course in university and an economics degree that was taught was in 1974. So anyone that studied economics since then really have no understanding of sound money from an economic perspective. Economic courses may touch on it and may even laugh at it and call it an ancient relic. And that's the problem right there. And we've had this neo-Keynesian, and now MMT, which is really just a Marxist economic ideology being pushed in the mainstream, getting pushed with financial journalists. And I really don't see that the policy prescription of Joseph Lyons will be implemented. I think they are going down the wrong path, and I think it's going to blow up in their faces. Maybe not now, maybe not tomorrow, but at some point this is going to end badly. But in our next video, stay tuned, because I'm going to give an example of the 1920-21 depression, which will really absolutely nail this debate. It will put the nail in the coffin in this debate. And I'll also give you an example of a modern day economy or a modern day nation that went through the Great Recession at the GFC and implemented a lot of these policies. And you'll be surprised by the growth and the drop in unemployment and the quality of life that they've experienced. So we'll have a look at that in our next episode. So join me then. Until then, thank you for joining me on this one. Love to hear your comments in the comments below, arguments, whatever, you name it. Just love to see your thoughts in the comments below. Until then, I'll see you next time on another episode of Finance Uncut.